Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am.
Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors.
I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message.
This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven.
Hey, Anchor Community, Pastor Bryan here. I'm excited to be continuing our teaching series, The Prayers Jesus Prayed. This week, we're going to be looking at the second half of the Lord's Prayer. Last week, we looked at the first half of the Lord's Prayer. But to catch us up, to kind of like fill in the gaps of our memory and to prepare us for today, I want to read the entirety of the Lord's Prayer. So it is in Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to be looking at verses 9 to 13. And it goes like this: This then is how you should pray. If you were with us last week, you might remember how Jesus said the different ways we shouldn't pray, and he then counsels us to pray like this. This then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed or holy be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Okay, right at the beginning here, Jesus, he tells us that we should pray for our needs. He gives us permission to pray. If you haven't been around the church maybe for a long time, or you're new to the church, let me just tell you about how difficult this seems to be in certain prayer request environments. In a small group, maybe you've experienced this. If you haven't been around the church, this is kind of be prepared for this. You know, like sometimes when the prayer requests are being shared at the end of the gathering, it gets to somebody and they're like, you know what? we just need to pray for my aunt's cat. It's been coughing up more hairballs than normal. We're all really concerned about it. And not to delegitimize the praying for cats. Some of us are getting a little nervous and holding our cats very tightly. Not to delegitimize it, but like what that often signals is an inability to kind of voice real personal needs. Or maybe sometimes like an unfamiliarity with like what your needs actually are. I love these two words that Jesus gives us towards how we should pray. My needs. All of the second half of the Lord's Prayer is about like your personal needs, my needs. And both of these two words, they illustrate something that can be a challenge to two different types of people. The first is like the type of person that is absorbed or enmeshed in kind of helping other people. Sometimes they're unable to differentiate between the needs of others and their own needs. So the type of person that is like a helper, they're always available for other people. Sometimes they get enmeshed so much that they find their identity in another person and they're unable to discern, what do I actually need? At its worst, this can be codependent, right? So the ability to voice my needs. Jesus gives us permission to pray my needs. But then also the other type of person that this challenges is like around this word, needs. So it challenges the person that's so familiar with their wants and getting their way that they're unable to discern what is an actual need and what is a wish or a want masquerading as a need. So Jesus doesn't give us permission to pray whatever our whims and desires are at the moment, though, I guess there's times for that. But he gives us a commission and permission to pray for our needs. This first permission to pray for my needs is in Matthew chapter 6, verse 11. It says, give us this day our daily bread. Let's look at this. The first two words, give us. This sounds a bit audacious, right? Give us. There's not like a groveling. There's not like please, I've done so much. Would you potentially? No, it's just give us. I think for me, it like reflects this intimacy of a parent-child relationship. This sense of like, I know my Father's provision and I'm coming freely to his feet saying, hey, where's breakfast? the intimacy of a parent-child relationship give us. Jesus is saying that we should have that level of familiarity as we approach our Heavenly Father with our real needs. God, I'm desperate for this. I need this. This is happening in my life. You see me fully. You know me fully. I'm coming empty-handed with this particular need. Give, God. And it goes on, it says, this day. The Greek is actually uncertain if it's like referring to this day or like tomorrow or the next day or give us like the rest, the need that I have in the future. It's like a weird thing with the Greek grammar that it's uncertain if it's just today or the tomorrows. But I love the immediacy of it. There's this sense of like, not just kind of conceptually give us what we need, but give us like this real thing in this real time. This give us today our daily bread. The temptation of daily bread is sometimes throughout the history of the church we've wanted to spiritualize it and say, give us our spiritual needs. But I think it's important. Like Jesus is like in a world where like bread and food is like it's essential, and it's not something where it's like there's always a stocked cupboard, but things like they age quicker. There aren't fridges, there are no preservatives, and there's an intimate connection to the ground, and like praying for the harvest is an important thing. And so there's this real deep connection to seeing God as the giver of our actual physical needs, and to not cast it off as just a spiritual reality. And there's this intimate familiarity with actual hunger, right? If the crop doesn't come, we're not able to bring in excess food from different countries or different parts of the world. It's like an intimate connection with food. And so like Jesus is saying, hey, we can pray to God for our real physical needs. You could think about like the physical needs that you have, even like right now, even while we have modern technology, but they're all interrelated. So it's like more than just food. It's like electricity for my fridge, a job to pay the bills, a car to go get groceries, wisdom on how to use our finances. All these things are like part and tied into this daily need that Jesus says, come to the Father with this. Like recognize that he's the giver of every good gift and come to him with your need. And if you have your provision, if it's like feels like it's like actually doesn't feel like a need because it comes so easily, start to pay attention to the fact that all of this is a gift from the one who gives all good gifts, as James says. You might even become aware, as you're like aware of that all of this is a gift, you might also become aware that there are real people in your city and around the world that are not experiencing the level of provision that you have. And so it might be a charge towards praying for them, that my needs are filled, but God, I know there are people that are crying out for their needs. Would you answer their prayers? Would you hear their prayers? I think there are like two errors when it comes to like praying for our needs. The first is like to pray without doing. I remember talking to a guy who felt called to be a missionary, and we went on a walk. We were talking. It was a great conversation. I was frankly inspired by his faith to go and leave what was known into a place that was new and different, out of a sense of the call of God. And I remember asking him this question, and I was like, so how are you raising your finances? Are you having fundraising meetings? And he goes, no, I'm just kind of waiting on God to, for the funds just to come. And I'm like, wait, so you're not talking to people? You're not like giving fundraising? I was expecting a pitch. I was expecting him to ask me for money, but he like says, no, we're just kind of like waiting and seeing. And I'm like, I think that's an inaccurate idea of what it means to wait on God. God's already given you what you need to do. If you really are being called to mission work, you need to go forward to raise the support so that you can go do the thing that God's already called you to do. You don't need to wait on God. He's given you what you need to do. Now follow him in trying to develop the resources for it. Sometimes we spiritualize it, and we don't voice our needs. It's a way of really just kind of like being timid about asking for what we actually need. Praying without doing is a problem. But on the other hand, doing without praying is also a problem. Because while praying without doing is a timidity around voicing our need that we really have, Doing without praying is not recognizing the source of every good gift. That the one who created all is the one who ultimately can be connected to our provision in every area of our life. And so ingratitude creeps in and self-dependence creeps in when prayer is not cultivated. We need to be people that are like praying, recognizing that God is the giver of every good gift. He's the reason there's food on the table. He's the reason there's a job I can go to. He's the reason there's gas in the tank. We need to recognize He's the giver of every good gift. As the theologian and Prime Minister Abraham Kuyper said, there's not 1 square inch of all creation of which Jesus Christ does not cry out, mine. He's the creator and the giver of every good gift. But then also we need to recognize that we're called to action. We're called to do. We're not called to just sit and wait in our house for all the things that we prayed for to happen magically and mysteriously on our front doorstep. God calls us to partnership and to shoulder work for His kingdom. Both of these things need to be connected together. Second element that we're given permission to pray for is our relationships. Jesus says, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And so there's this vertical and horizontal thing that happens here in Jesus' prayer. You see that? Forgive us our debts. He's praying to God. So there's this vertical, God, would you forgive me? Would you give your forgiveness? Would you forgive me? I own this. This is happening in my life. I've done this. I've failed here. I've ended up falling short here. Would you forgive me? I love this because it recognizes like an ownership of the issue. There's no rationalization. There's no minimization. It's just, God, forgive me. And then also, there's, as we forgive our debtors, there's an assumption that we are people of forgiveness. Jesus is telling us that we should make a habit of asking God for forgiveness, and clearly we should have a habit of forgiving other people, as it's seen as the normative position that's assumed in this prayer. That forgiveness is assumed. When it comes to like this assumption, it's important that we spend a little time on it because I don't think forgiveness is always like our default setting with others. We could fall into one of two kind of opposite errors. First is what you could call rationalization and excusing. We might say rationalization and excusing of other people's harm, like the harm that people have caused us. And rather than forgiving, this is different from forgiving, but rationalizing and excusing might sound like, well, if I didn't do enough for them, maybe I didn't do enough for them. I probably should have served them more. That's why they did that. It's really my fault. Or rationalizing and excusing might sound like they've had a tough go of it. It's not their fault. One way or another, if someone causes us harm, we bypass forgiveness by rationalizing and assuming. The first example I gave there is of placing the blame on ourselves rather than the person that caused us harm. The second example is just minimizing the harm caused, it's like not something that they can be held responsible for because of some difficulty in their life. Rather, that bypasses forgiveness because it minimizes the pain, which is very real. It doesn't solve the problem. The other opposite error, besides rationalizing and excusing, is what you could call restrained vengeance. Restrained vengeance. So like forgiveness is not like looking at someone that caused you harm and gritting your teeth and thinking things in your head, but not acting upon them, right? Just because you don't launch into a full smear campaign or seek the other's harm doesn't mean you've forgiven them. I love what Lewis Smedes in the just classic book, Forgive, Not Forget, he says this: vengeance is having a videotape planted in your soul that cannot be turned off. It plays the painful scene over and over again inside your mind. And each time it plays, you feel the clap of pain again. Forgiving turns off the videotape of pained memory. Forgiving sets you free. This is the invitation, really, for forgiveness. It's not to minimize the pain, but walk around wounded because of it, like disassociating that part that's really pained from the person who caused it. And neither is it with this restrained vengeance where I am trying to smile, but I'm gritting my teeth and I'm thinking thoughts that are showing that I have not forgiven. Forgiveness, as Smedes mentions, is really about our freedom. Jesus followers, we get our definition of forgiveness from Jesus. Like Peter goes up to Jesus, and I love this. It's out of the blue. We have no context for it. You could imagine maybe Peter had some type of tough interaction and with maybe a fellow disciple or some family friend. We don't know. But he goes up to Jesus in Matthew 18:21. He says, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister that sins against me? Like how many times? Like 7 times? And Jesus says 70 times 7. This number of perfection and infinity. Keep forgiving. Modern psychology, and Smedes points to this, is that forgiveness really is about our freedoms. Jesus knew the secret back then. Not only are we doing what he asks of us, but we're setting ourselves free when we forgive. We're not playing that videotape of vengeance in our head that just brings back the pain to our own memory every time we replay it. We're releasing that, and we're moving towards freedom. But also, in that, we're becoming more like Jesus himself. You see, after Jesus says 70 times 7, the number of perfection, and then times 7, so infinity, this kind of constantly doing it. After he says that, he launches into a parable. Oh, to be one of Jesus's disciples. You ask him a point-blank question, and he's like, let me tell you a story, Talk about sometimes, leaving it to our own discernment to really get the meaning of it. But he tells a story about what's called the unmerciful servant, where a servant who was deeply in debt and could not repay his debts goes to the master and says, would you forgive me? The master forgives him, and then the servant is free from his debt, goes out into the world, finds somebody who is his servant, the servant's servant, and the servant's servant says, hey, would you forgive me my debts? And the unmerciful servant says to his servant, no. Jesus gives this illustration of the weirdness of being disciples that continue, that do not offer forgiveness, even though we've been forgiven. This is the picture, that God's mercy is so much that he forgives us 70 times 70 times 70 times 70. And then we should respond by being people of forgiveness because we've been forgiven so much ourselves. Jesus' invitation is towards giving to others what we have received from God, forgiveness. Is this a difficult, nuanced, challenging issue? Yes. Does forgiveness mean you take down boundaries down from people that have caused you hurt or harm? No. Boundaries need to remain up there. Trust needs to be rebuilt. Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean reunification. It doesn't mean you become best friends. Forgiveness is simply releasing the videotape of the pained memory and releasing and relaxing your grip on that really ends up keeping you in prison yourself. I would say forgiveness is a journey. Forgiveness is not a one-time act. Forgiveness is a journey. In my own life, there's been times where I've had to be on the receiving end of forgiveness because I've done something, frankly, boneheadedly, or I've done something boneheaded. And sometimes that journey of being forgiven or sometimes the act of being forgiven is a journey where trust has to be rebuilt. And it takes time, and it's painful. For some of us watching right now, we're in that journey where we're either being forgiven or we're seeking to forgive. And I just want to give you grace and say, sometimes it takes time. Stay at it. If you find yourself grabbing that tape and putting it back in the proverbial VCR, if you can remember what that is, and playing it again. Just every time you sense you're doing that, try to relax your grip on it. Try to remember the words of Jesus 70 times 7. Try to remember how much we've been forgiven. If you find yourself in a place where you're seeking to forgive, and I've been there too, where harm has been caused to me or pain I've been the object of pain. I would say one of the marks to see that you're on the right track is, are you growing in compassion for the person? Are you growing in an ability to kind of see them as human? If you're finding yourself growing in compassion, you're actually growing in the character of Christ. And it's a mark that you're moving deeper and deeper into that journey of fully forgiving. Well, Jesus goes on and he talks about permission to pray for my spiritual life, the spiritual life. In Matthew 6:13, he says, "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one." It's interesting, in our discussion, in preparation for this teaching, we often have multiple people in the room talking through it and what do you see? And we're praying, we're looking at commentaries. It's a fun environment. One person mentioned, hey, pretty recently before this, Jesus himself endured temptation. He went into the wilderness. He was tempted by the devil. He was fasting. He was in a vulnerable state, being tempted. So it's kind of interesting imagining this as Jesus saying, when he says, "And lead us not into temptation," he's saying, this is how you should pray. Believe me, I've been in that place of challenging temptation. Just ask God to never lead you there. Ask God to keep you from that challenging spot of pain-filled, just really strained temptation. Temptation is a place that we often do find ourselves led. If we have any self-awareness at all, we know that there are certain things that will uniquely tempt us. And the pathway there is sometimes something that we stumble into or intentionally walk into. Jesus is saying, God, would you keep me from it? Would you steer me clear of temptation? And I think part of that is recognizing what temptation actually is. Oftentimes, if you could think of a funhouse mirror, right, where it distorts reality, I think temptation does this to reality. It distorts what truth is. And so we get, rather than a funhouse mirror, how it makes us look silly and ridiculous, temptation distorts reality in the way where it makes destruction look beautiful. And so we are enticed towards it because either the demonic or our own psyche has had this conception, or the world's portrayal has had this ability to celebrate destruction. One of the most, the two most fascinating shows recently in the last, 15, 20 years for me have been Breaking Bad and Ozarks. Maybe you're familiar with them. Maybe you're unfamiliar with the pastor referring to them in a teaching. But Breaking Bad, the central character is a science teacher named Walter White, who is in this place of deep need and sees an opportunity to utilize his science to start making meth. Ozarks, similarly, it's the family that sees an opportunity to cut corners and take advantage, find opportunities. But both with finances and crime and drugs and all these things, but both stories accurately describe the nature of the illusion for what it is. Because they reveal that this thing that is enticing people in a place of need and an opportunity ends up being their downfall. And the trajectory of the storyline is not to aggrandize and celebrate the pursuit of temptation, but to see it as the object of destruction. While this, I cannot fully recommend the shows, they describe reality as it is. That the illusory nature of temptation is always something that causes destruction. It's important to note temptation is not something that just causes your personal destruction, but it always leaves a wake of trauma. Your temptation that Jesus is saying you should pray to not be led into it. Your temptation is not something that is your temptation. It affects your spouse, your family, your mother, your father, your friends. It affects everyone. It leaves a wake of trauma. We are not isolated individuals with our decisions only affecting us. We are woven into community, and every decision affects another. This is one of the reasons why I love at Anchor, why we're leaning into Celebrate Recovery. Because recovery forces us to be aware of our weakness and sin nature and shadow side, and really is this stark and beautiful recognition that we are not to flirt with temptation, but to recognize the deceptive and seductive power of our own broken desires. I don't think there are many, apart from recovery groups and the church, that take this seriously in the world. The world right now celebrates and flirts with it and sees temptation as normative. But the church, Scripture, Jesus' invitation is to see that no, temptation is still destructive. In my own personal devotions, I'm reading 1 Kings. 1 Kings opens with 10 or so chapters talking about Solomon, the king. Solomon is the son of David, and he takes over David's throne after him. Whereas David has like a book and a half written about him. Solomon has 10 chapters. But it's interesting because Solomon is said to be the wisest person that ever lived. He prays for wisdom. God grants him wisdom, but he's unable to avoid temptation, even with all of his wisdom. And what happens is, he falls because he is unable to avoid his temptation. And the rest of the First Kings sets a trajectory where everyone follows suit. We need to be sober-minded when it comes to temptation. I do think, interestingly enough, the author, spiritual writer Henry Nouwen, a favorite of mine and many at Anchor, is wise in speaking to sometimes the subtle nature of temptation. Henry Nouwen says the greatest temptation is actually self-rejection. And he's not talking about self-rejection in the sense of like, he's talking about like the positive God-made self. Your positive God-made self. Sometimes in the church, we say we need to deny the self, we need to reject the self. And sometimes that can be true if we ever understanding things correctly, but there's a God-made you that should not be rejected. It says sometimes the greatest temptation is self-rejection, because when you reject yourself, you reject the voice of God that calls you beloved. And then you try to fill that vacancy with the temptations of sex, power over others, and at the expense of others, drink to the point of addiction and dependence. He makes this argument that the rejection of self begins a journey towards avoiding the voice of God and slipping into filling that absence of God's voice with other things that the world might lift up, celebrate, and entice us with. Things that might take the edge off the fact that we can't hear the voice of the beloved. So right now, where you're at, wherever you're watching, I want to invite you to be the first thing on your mind is to hear right now the voice of the beloved. You are loved. Recall from last week how Jesus said, pray to God like you would your dad. Call him Father. Call him love. Call him the source. Understand him as the source of provision. Understand that he is not far off, that he loves you. Going on, understand that he's the one, as we talked about today, that has forgiven you. He knows what you did in secret that you buried and hid, and his disposition towards you is not of wagging a finger, but welcoming you near. The voice of the Father says, "You are my beloved." You don't need to fill the vacancies of acceptance and or lack of acceptance with pursuing that romantic relationship at the expense of whoever, or pursuing taking the edge off with porn or drink or whatever. You don't have to do that. Just recognize the voice of the beloved. The voice of the Father says, "You are mine." The greatest picture of this is the cross, where on the cross, Jesus Christ showed the depth of his love, that God would not only be willing to be born in a manger, but die on the object of social and physical pain, the cross in the Roman world, so that all that is broken in us might be transferred to him, so he might break under that, so that we might be healed. That's the depth of his love, and that's what's offered to you. So this is prayer where it begins with our Father in heaven. Holy be your name, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as in heaven, and ends with give us today our daily bread, where he gives us permission to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts. God would forgive us our debts. Here they are. As we have also forgiven others, counsels us to see forgiveness as a normative disposition for our disciples, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. It can be a prayer on our lips that we can call on a Father who is near, and we can know that we are forgiven, and we can know that he is with us, and that his voice is one that says beloved, and so we don't have to fill that vacancy with any other thing.